The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC for short, was a group of mostly young, highly motivated and educated individuals that sought to change their futures for the better by disrupting the natural order in the United States during the 1960s and 70s. The main goal was to drive student participation in the civil rights movement going on at the time. To better understand SNCC, it is beneficial to analyze a few key points of the movement that spread across the South and helped them gain momentum that ultimately became one of the most notable groups in the fight for civil rights. SNCC arguably would have never been founded if it weren't for the Greensboro Four and their very bold decision to sit in at the lunch counter of Woolworth's store on February 1st, 1960. By examining these sit-ins, it is possible to gain a better understanding of SNCC and the motivation that they had behind their founding and demonstrations throughout the United States during such a turbulent time. After this initial sit-in gained attention nationally, Ella Baker, an established civil rights figure, sought to bring together young people in order to not only give them a voice in the civil rights movement, but to utilize their energy and commitment to a cause in order to formulate social change. In a letter sent out by Ella Baker to youth leaders across the South, she states that the courageous, dedicated, and thoughtful leadership manifested by hundreds of Negro students on college campuses in large cities and small towns, and the overwhelming support by thousands of others, present new challenges for the future. This great potential for social change now calls for evaluation in terms of where do we go from here? In the remainder of this letter from Ella Baker, she makes clear that these sit-ins are much bigger than, and I quote, a hamburger or a Coca-Cola. These sit-ins were the start of a movement that would ultimately sweep the nation. She made it clear that African Americans would no longer accept second-class citizenship in a country that would allow them to go fight in a world war, but upon their return would refuse and never even consider something as simple as service in a public setting. It is remarkable that we put trust into African Americans and poor whites to defend our great nation during that time, but refused to acknowledge this upon their return home from a war that ended in the dropping of an atomic bomb. Students were more than willing to allow adult figures and leaders to provide insight and suggestions in how they should carry their vision forward, but they would not be dominated, and they most certainly would not be manipulated. Ella Baker made an initial call to action via a summit in Raleigh, North Carolina, and that was the first step towards an ongoing effort to bring college students together to nonviolently demonstrate against segregation in the South. At the time of the first summit, Ella is still connected with Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, which at that time was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC for short. In the document, you can see that she signs off as executive director and Martin Luther King Jr. as president. In fact, it should also be noted that SCLC gave the initial seed money to found SNCC in the form of an $800 check prior to the summit. In her letter to students, Ella Baker mentions that each state and/or community should carefully consider who to send to the summit because there was only enough lodging and funds for a certain amount of delegates. Abided by during that time. In the founding of SNCC, in the SNCC founding statement, post-summit, the line that stands out most is this: by appealing to conscience and standing on the moral nature of human existence, nonviolence nurtures the atmosphere in which reconciliation and justice become actual possibilities. When analyzed, it is clear that initially the intention of SNCC and its members was to follow in the footsteps of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his peaceful, nonviolent way of protesting. Interestingly enough, SNCC had the ability to motivate people to join their cause, and oftentimes they were able to do so by convincing these individuals to take pay cuts or no money at all in return for what they deemed was a universal movement and something that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They also trained people, even if it was minimally, on how to be useful in protests, A great example is the document from the University Archives of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which indicate the do's and don'ts for picketers at the sit-in events, as well as other demonstrations across the North and the South. Interestingly enough, in the section that states who can picket, it indicates that they will only use picketers if they agree to go through a short course of instruction on picketing, which ties back into the fact that they were more than willing to train individuals with no prior demonstration background. Take a moment and think about this situation. You're a young, educated African American in the South, and you are trying to find an organization to join that has shared values. You meet with SNCC and they speak about nonviolent resistance and strict personal discipline when taking part in peaceful protests. You are told bluntly that the irritated white community may arrest you, may kick you, bite you, pull your hair, put cigarettes out on you, or many of the other atrocities committed to these young men and women who were protesting the lunch counters. The question is then, do you still want to join? If yes, it is abundantly clear that you as an individual are willing to give your life to a cause that will forever change the landscape of America. As we know from history's past, action creates action, and movements grow because of those who are brave enough to step forward and demand change. Grassroots organizing played a large role in how sit-ins across the country took place. And even if SNCC wasn't involved directly, they were always available as a resource to those who chose to defy the unjust laws in the South. SNCC members utilized student leadership and creativity in getting the news out about their organization and the greater movement taking place. The most beneficial piece of literature that they put out was The Student Voice, with the goal of communicating SNCC's movements both internally and externally, and coverage of their nonviolent protests to students throughout America at the time. In the first publication, they had an abundance of information, as you can see here. This shows that there is a true movement in place, and the people will stop at nothing to ensure that those who choose to do right are given fair treatment, even if it is in a privatized sector. The paper also has illustrations similar to those in newspapers today, as well as sections on fundraising methods, editors' choices, poetry, and special stories and highlights, chosen to frame SNCC as a progressive movement that is appealing enough to join. By using a newspaper to send out to colleges across the map, they were clearly able to open the eyes of so many young individuals who had yet to hear about the movements or fully grip and comprehend the activism that was taking place in the same nation they resided in. In addition to the Student Voice, SNCC also would send out an internal newsletter to its followers. This newsletter was spectacular and had some of the most interesting pieces of information available to date. In Volume 1, it clearly indicates that SNCC is a fully functioning organization throughout the South and the North, respectively. There is a call to action to boycott certain stores, such as Walgreens and Howard Johnson restaurants, who have refused service to SNCC members. They also list individuals who have been arrested at sit-ins and how to donate funds to use for bail money, and best of all, most importantly, there are listings of upcoming events such as the Freedom Singers, who apparently are slated to perform at Carnegie Hall on February 1st of the following year, which is indicative of the anniversary of the Greensboro sit-ins 2 years prior that started the entire movement. Lastly, there's a final section of the document that states, to all staff members, this newsletter is intended to serve as a secondary means of communication between the Atlanta office and your far-flung efforts. The primary means of communications must be initiated by you. It is called the Field Report and is to be filled with this office weekly, or in this case of action, daily. In addition, we, in the offices, need pictures of action demonstrations, voter schools, yourselves, newspaper clippings which mention you or your program. SNCC was undoubtedly one of the most successful organizations in the fight for civil rights during a time when so many people were neglected of the most simplistic liberties in America. In addition to the sit-in movements across the South, SNCC successfully implemented and helped organize the Freedom Rides, voter registration in Mississippi, which at the time was a predominantly Klan-ridden state, and they can absolutely most assuredly be credited with helping get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. They had resilient leaders like John Lewis, who is still in office today as a congressman, and they had so many young men and women, both black and white, show up to fight for a cause against unjust laws. At the end of the day, as we look back on the history of this group and the history of our great nation, it is important to understand that everything has been earned, not given, to those who quite frankly deserved it all along.